Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are undertaking a really critical and extensive exploration of a field that is, I think it's fair to say, experiencing a monumental intellectual and political shift.
That's putting it mildly.
We're talking about modern qualitative research. And this isn't just a discussion of, interviewing techniques or how to take field notes.
No, not at all.
We are examining a discipline that is actively, and I mean actively, challenging its own history, its own vocabulary, and its own mission.
What we're looking at today are sources that really introduce this intellectual terrain, both the discipline and, the practice of it. And they describe the field as currently being, and this is a great phrase, midway between two extremes.
Midway between two extremes. That sounds like a tense place to be.
It's a place of incredibly intense transition. You have older paradigms that are being completely reconfigured, and at the same time, a whole new language of inquiry is emerging.
So our mission today, for you, the learner, is to give you a fast but exceptionally thorough grasp of this dynamic landscape.
Exactly. So you can understand the ideological battles and, just as importantly, the practical methods that are defining what research even means right now.
Okay, let's unpack this new language immediately because that seems to be the first big signpost of this change. The vocabulary has expanded so far beyond the traditional, academic definition of
It really
research.
has.
When we look at these sources, we see this incredible, dynamic, new family of terms used to describe the work. It's no longer just research.
Right.
We were talking about inquiry, critique, social justice, transformative, dialogic, reflexive, participatory, emancipatory. The list just goes on.
And it gets even more surprising for a field that's supposed to be about methodology. You see terms like love, loss, praxis, rigor
Love and loss in a methods textbook.
in a methods textbook.
Yeah.
And then there's this ultimate concept that I think really speaks to the philosophical scope of the work. It's described as a way of being in the world.
A way of being in the world. Wow.
This expansion of terminology, it signals that the researcher's whole self-concept and the intention behind the work have fundamentally shifted.
So it's not just about producing knowledge anymore.
It's about enacting a change. It's about transformation.
I am particularly struck by terms like love and loss, appearing in what is at its core a methodological discussion. What does that signal about the required, the emotional and philosophical commitment of a researcher today?
It signals that the researcher is deeply, and I mean deeply, embedded within the community they're studying. There's no longer this pretense of the detached, objective observer.
The scientist in the white lab coat.
Gone. Love and loss imply a shared vulnerability, a real commitment to what's called praxis, which is that cycle of informed, purposeful action based on theory, then reflecting, then acting again.
And it suggests the work carries a huge moral weight.
A significant moral weight, yes. It's meant to contrast sharply with that traditional model. The goal is to acknowledge the full human experience, the joy, the pain, the love, the loss, as absolutely central to the research process itself.
And this brings up a crucial point you mentioned, which the sources really emphasize, the shift in preferred terminology. Why is the word inquiry sometimes explicitly preferred over research? I mean, research sounds established, respectable, doesn't it?
It does, and that's precisely the historical problem with the word.
Ah.
It carries immense historical baggage, particularly when you're discussing studies that involve marginalized or colonized populations. One of the sources we looked at cites this powerful, almost heartbreaking indictment
Racist.
that research is perhaps one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous world's vocabulary.
That is an incredibly strong statement. Why such a visceral reaction?
Because for centuries, the concept of research has been tied to the worst excesses of colonialism. You have to think back to the 19th and 20th centuries.
Right.
Indigenous peoples were often, collected, classified, categorized. They were turned into objects of study, and then they were represented, or more often misrepresented, back to the West.
And those representations were then used to justify oppressive policies.
Exactly. The goal was the extraction of data, not collaboration, and certainly not empowerment. This is why a modern researcher has to confront their own positionality and the history of their discipline before they even begin.
That is a profound indictment of the discipline's past. So when today's researchers choose the word inquiry, what is the alternative they're trying to offer?
Inquiry suggests an open-endedness. It suggests a recognition of uncertainty, of ambiguity, that the older, more positivist term research just might not allow for.
It's less about finding a definitive answer.
And more about being in a continuous process of learning. One source, Demetriadis, frames inquiry not just as a scholarly activity, but as an act of activism and resistance.
So it's political from the outset.
Inherently, it shifts the focus away from just collecting facts and toward engaging in this ongoing, often political process of learning and hopefully change.
So the role of critical qualitative research, then, is overtly political. There's no hiding it.
Oh, explicitly so. It is historical in its orientation. It seeks what are called emancipatory visions and social justice.
So the critical inquirer is actively trying to address inequality, poverty, oppression.
Yes, all of it. The goal is to actively address these prevailing forms of injustice. This kind of inquiry carries a moral and political authority to, well, to move people towards struggling against oppression. The ultimate goal is transformation and liberation, not just description.
Well, if that's the goal, it necessitates a fundamental shaking of the theoretical foundations.
It has to.
And the sources state that the field is in transition, with these older paradigms being actively reconfigured.
Exactly. We are witnessing the emergence of what are called hybrid paradigms, and they're emerging alongside new geographies of knowledge.
New geographies of knowledge. What does that mean in practice?
It means we're finally seeing vital decolonizing epistemologies. These are theories and methods developed outside the traditional Western academic centers outside of Europe and North America.
So it's challenging the idea that all valid knowledge comes from one part of the world.
It's a complete rejection of that idea.
That sounds like a complete overhaul of the philosophical toolkit.
Yeah.
And I want to zero in on a phrase mentioned in the sources, because this is where the discussion gets, I think, truly radical. They talk about the ontological turn in social theory.
Yes. This is a huge shift.
So just to be clear for our listener, ontology is the study of being, or the nature of reality, correct?
That's right. For centuries, social science was predominantly focused on epistemology, which is the study of how we know things, how do we get knowledge.
Right.
The ontological turn shifts the focus from what we know to what reality actually is. And, crucially, how different cultural groups might experience fundamentally different forms of reality. It's a profound questioning of the very nature of existence itself.
And this has a surprising link to something most people view as the ultimate objective tool: statistics.
It does.
The source mentions alternative ontologies of counting. What on earth does that mean?
This is a contribution from a scholar named Lather, and the logic goes like this. If reality itself is not singular, if it is experienced differently by different people, then the way we quantify, measure, and count that reality must also be reevaluated.
So you're questioning the numbers themselves.
You're questioning what the act of counting even does. Instead of viewing statistics purely as objective, neutral fact, which is the language of positivism, researchers are now exploring how statistics can be used for, and this is the key phrase, strategic indigenous interventions.
How does that look in practice? What does a strategic indigenous intervention using statistics actually involve?
It means using data not to generalize across a population defined by, say, Western metrics, but to leverage that data within a political or a bureaucratic system that demands quantification to be heard.
Ah, so it's using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house.
That's one way to put it, yes. It's a strategic deployment. It questions who has the right to observe and count whom, and what ultimately does counting even mean in a complex multicultural world where the phenomena being counted might not be static or singular.
So the discipline isn't settling for simple definitions anymore.
It's questioning the very building blocks of reality itself.
To truly grasp the urgency of this contemporary shift, we have to recognize where this, for lack of a better word, academic drama came from.
It's definitely a drama.
And it came from what the sources call the paradigm wars redux. These methodological struggles of the 1970s and 1980s that, as you said earlier, still haunt the present.
They absolutely define the structure of power in academia today. There's no escaping them, especially in fields like education, sociology, public policy. Their legacy is everywhere.
And we need to be clear, these struggles of the 70s and 80s, they weren't just, polite intellectual disagreements over a cup of tea.
Oh, not at all. They were intense, high-stakes political battles. This was about funding, about legitimacy, about career survival.
So how high were the stakes for a qualitative researcher during this period?
The stakes were extremely high. Qualitative research was often heavily criticized, frequently dismissed as, Soft science or just, anecdotal.
Not rigorous.
Not rigorous was the killer phrase. For junior faculty seeking tenure, choosing to employ these methods was professionally precarious. It could, and sometimes did, jeopardize their entire career trajectory.
All because their work was deemed insufficiently rigorous by committees that were steeped in quantitative norms.
Precisely. And the main threat looming over them, the gravitational center of the whole conflict, was the government-sanctioned exclusivist assertion of positivism as the gold standard.
That seems to be the core tension that defines the last 50 years of social science.
It is. The emerging new paradigm war, and we'll get to the later versions of this war, was fundamentally threatened by this notion that positivism should be the only acceptable approach.
And positivism demands objective measurement, rigorous systematic methodology, reliable and valid data.
All things that positivism values. And this was especially true if federal funding was involved. If you wanted government money, you had to play by their rules.
And positivism really values generalization and external validity, right? The ability to apply findings from a small sample to a larger population.
Yes, and those are things that qualitative work, almost by definition, often deprioritizes.
In favor of what?
In favor of deep, rich, contextual understanding of a specific case or situation.
And government bodies reinforce this tension through the rise of these evidence-based research movements.
Absolutely. They fix standards and guidelines, often demanding the perceived superiority of quantitative methods.
And one method in particular.
The randomized controlled trial, or the RCT. The medical model. This was institutional control being exerted through methodology.
So if you were a qualitative researcher trying to survive, trying to publish, during the peak of this 1980s positivist wave, what was your strategic move?
Well, survival necessitated adaptation. You couldn't just ignore the power structure. The sources mention that the heart of the matter for many in that earlier generation was simply how to make their deeply interpretive work palatable.
Palatable to their positivist colleagues and to the journals they control.
Exactly. And this led to calls for something called a strategic positivism.
That sounds like a complete contradiction in terms. Strategic positivism. What did that look like in practice?
It was, a tactical compromise. Researchers would use what we now call quasi-statistics.
So not full-blown statistical modeling.
No. Simple frequencies, percentages, maybe some cross-tabulated observations, counts of how often a particular theme appeared in their interview transcripts.
So they were giving their work a superficial facade of quantitative rigor.
That's the perfect way to put it. They weren't fundamentally changing their philosophical approach or their deep interpretive analysis, but they were adding just enough measurable elements to satisfy the gatekeepers.
It was a sophisticated professional negotiation.
Aimed squarely at institutional survival. It was a way to speak the language of power just well enough to secure a seat at the academic table.
And looking at the long legacy of those 1980s paradigm wars, we see that they were profoundly consequential.
They created a ready-made institutional apparatus.
An apparatus that favored certain methodologies.
Experimentation, mixed methods, but usually only if it was done from a quantitative baseline. And crucially, it allowed for the intrusion of government into setting the research agendas for entire fields.
And we can't forget who was disproportionately affected by this struggle for cultural capital. It was the critical voices, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed. The struggle led to a serious, you might even say crippling, of research, especially critical research focused on social justice.
Like what kinds of research?
Critical pedagogy, work from critical theorists, feminist analyses. They all struggled immensely to acquire the power and cultural capital needed to do work for marginalized groups.
The poor, non-whites, women, LGBTQ communities.
Yes. When the focus shifts entirely to quantitative generalization, the contextual, the nuanced, and the political concerns of these groups are often the first things to be dismissed as unscientific.
Let's break down the actual conflicts within those wars because it's fascinating. The sources detail 3 distinct phases or moments of conflict, which I think are often mistakenly just lumped together as the paradigm wars.
Yes, that's a really important clarification. A couple of scholars, Charles Tedley and Abbas Tashikori, they provide a history that really helps separate these different conflicts.
So what was the first conflict?
The first conflict covered the early period, roughly from 1970 to about 1990. And during this time, the positivists, the post-positivists, and the critical theorists, They were actually in dialogue with one
So
another.
they were talking.
They were talking, they were ideological adversaries for sure, but they engaged on shared concerns. They were arguing about ethics, about field studies, about the concept of praxis, about the criteria for evaluating research, and about the role of values in the whole process.
So they were arguing about the correct path forward, but they were at least sitting at the same table, so to speak.
Correct. The second conflict, however, was far more intense. It was almost existential for the field. This was the incompatibility dispute.
The incompatibility dispute.
Or, as it was also known, the struggle for paradigm purity. This was the intellectual impasse.
Okay, tell us more about that.
Yeah.
What was the core philosophical threat that made it so intense?
The dispute involved individuals who were completely convinced that quantitative and qualitative methods and paradigms could not be combined. Period.
Why not?
Because of the fundamental differences in their underlying assumptions.
Hmm.
The argument went like this. If your paradigm assumes that reality is objective and measurable, which is positivism,
Right.
and my paradigm assumes that reality is socially constructed and relative, which is constructivism, how can we possibly use both methods in the same study?
To combine them would be to commit a kind of philosophical self-contradiction.
That's exactly how they saw it. They saw it as intellectual sloppiness, a betrayal of your core principles.
So the danger wasn't really methodological. It was ontological and epistemological. They felt that mixing the methods invalidated the entire philosophical premise of the work.
Precisely. Now, initially, some researchers tried to resolve this through triangulation.
Which is the idea of studying the same phenomenon with multiple methods to increase your confidence in the finding.
Yes. But the purists challenged even this. They argued that triangulation didn't solve the problem. It just confirmed the absolute superiority of one paradigm over the other, depending on which method produced the strongest result.
So it just became another battleground.
It did. The era was characterized by these endless arguments and debates over paradigm superiority, and it often led to just really entrenched, bitter divisions within academic departments.
That sounds absolutely exhausting. Years and years of academic warfare based on these foundational philosophical differences. So how did researchers escape that impasse?
Well, this leads us directly into what the sources call the third moment,
Yeah.
and it brought a massive, and I would say pragmatic shift.
A pragmatic shift.
The shift was almost like a collective sigh of relief from the field, though, some of the more hardcore critics might say it was a surrender of philosophical rigor.
What happened?
In the post-1990 period, you see the emergence of this soft, almost apolitical, pragmatic paradigm. The deep philosophical incompatibility that fueled the 1980s wars was, almost overnight, declared irrelevant.
So quantitative and qualitative methods suddenly became compatible.
Yes, and not because philosophers finally resolved the deep ontological differences, but because empirical researchers on the ground just decided they were useful.
So the intellectual fighting stopped because researchers essentially decided, look, if it works on the ground to answer our research question, we're going to use it.
That is the very definition of pragmatism in this context. They prioritize the practical application, what the sources call the politics of evidence, over the purity of the philosophy.
And this is what's called the third moment dialogue.
Yes, it's defined as an epistemological position that resolved the 1980s disputes by simply mediating between the quantitative and qualitative traditions.
But it's essential to know that this third moment wasn't a single monolithic resolution.
Not at all. The sources are very clear on this. They identify two distinct versions of this third moment, one focusing on practical acceptance and the other on a more critical engagement.
Okay, let's start with version 1, the pragmatic acceptance.
Version 1 is characterized by the explicit, loud, and clear rejection of the incompatibility thesis. This version celebrated the demise of the singularity argument, that idea that you have to only use methods from a single, pure paradigm.
And this is where the mixed methods approach really comes into its own and formalizes its dominance.
It absolutely does. This version essentially said, there's no good reason for academic researchers to fear forging ahead with what works on an empirical level, regardless of all that philosophical baggage from the 80s. It was a huge victory for methodological flexibility and utility.
And then there's version 2, and this sounds much more critical, retaining that political edge we were talking about earlier.
Version 2 is populated by branches of the global interpretive community who were not satisfied with simply being pragmatic.
Pragmatism wasn't enough for them.
No. Scholars here critically engage and critique the powerful external forces that are still trying to enforce conformity. specifically the scientifically based research or SBR movement.
We'll get to that in more detail
We
later.
will. But for now, the key is that these version 2 scholars emphasize the political and moral consequences of adhering to these narrow, externally imposed views of science.
So while version 1 is focused on how to combine methods, version 2 is focused on why the combination matters.
Exactly. Specifically, how can research, mixed method or not, serve social justice purposes?
They resist the notion that your methodology should ever be disconnected from content, from justice, or from, doing science in the world.
Precisely. They're asking these pointed questions about the politics of evidence. Why is this method privileged? Who benefits from this definition of rigor? They are using the flexibility that was gained in the third moment to amplify those critical voices.
So today, qualitative inquiry is clearly not marginalized anymore. It's central to this international discourse. And the influence of these new perspectives is mapped out beautifully in what the sources call the 21st century interpretive communities.
These communities represent the philosophical trajectory of the field. They are these 5 dynamic, evolving intellectual spaces, or figured spaces, as the text calls them.
And each one makes different assumptions about knowledge, about reality, about the relationship between the researcher and the subject, and about the role of language.
Yes, all of those things.
Can we walk the listener through these 5 figured spaces? I think it's a really helpful map.
Absolutely. They map onto the classic paradigm models we've been discussing, but they offer a much more nuanced view of the evolution.
So, space number 1.
Number 1 is positivist objectivism.
Yeah.
This is the foundation we've been talking about. Reality is external, it's stable, it's objective, and it's independent of the observer.
And the goal is generalization and prediction through measurement.
Exactly. Think of classical behavioral psychology or large-scale survey research that's aiming for statistical reliability.
Okay, then the second space.
Interpretive modernism. This is where the focus shifts. Here, reality is seen as socially constructed. It's mediated by language, by meaning, by culture.
And the goal is no longer prediction, but deep understanding.
Yes, the German concept of Verstehen. This aligns with constructivism and traditional ethnography, where you immerse yourself in a culture to understand it from the inside.
Then we move to the third space. Skepticism, praxis, critical.
Moving beyond just interpretation, this space recognizes that reality isn't just socially constructed, it's structured by power, by inequality, by historical conditions.
And so the goal has to be transformation and emancipation.
Yes, linking that theoretical understanding to real-world action, that's the concept of praxis again. This is the home of critical theory and most feminist research.
And number 4.
Power knowledge, post-structural. This is an even deeper inquiry into how power operates. It starts to question the very existence of stable subjects or objective meanings.
So it's focused on discourse, how language doesn't just describe reality, it actually creates it.
Precisely. You can think of Michel Foucault here, questioning how disciplinary structures, like prisons or schools, actually create the concept of the subject they claim to study.
And finally, the 5th and newest space. Ontological, post-qualitative, post-materialism.
This is the newest and by far the most radical break from tradition. It questions the central role of the human subject entirely.
Wait, it removes the human from the center of social science?
In a way, yes. It focuses on matter, on affect, on non-representational theories. It challenges the assumption that only conscious humans have agency.
So these spaces aren't just methodological choices a researcher makes. They represent fundamental, competing worldviews about what research is and what it should be.
Exactly. And while you could say that the first 2 spaces, the positivist and the interpretive, are often where concrete research questions get answered, it's in the latter 3, the critical, the post-structural, and the ontological, where the really intense dialogue about language, power, and the absolute limits of human knowledge takes place.
This complexity leads us directly into a fascinating current trend that the sources highlight. The blurring of boundaries.
Yes.
Specifically, the qual divide, the old quantitative versus qualitative battle, especially as technology and political urgency intersect in the 21st century.
The disciplinary borders are just dissolving. That old rivalry, the war we were just talking about, it might finally be fading as researchers just look for the most effective tool for the job.
And the sources refer to this as the qual divide, and they say the blurring is profound.
It is.
Can you give us some concrete examples of this blurring? Because the sources mention these crossover methods that would have seemed almost impossible just 20 years ago.
Okay, think about radical feminists using biostatistics.
Right. Traditionally, feminism is highly critical of positivist methods.
Deeply critical. Yet here they are, strategically employing quantitative analysis. And they're not doing it to generalize in the old positivist way, but to expose material inequalities using the very language of government data.
So they're using the numbers to make a political point.
A very powerful one. Similarly, you have post-structuralists who are all about language and discourse, now engaging with post-humanists, moving beyond just the text into the material conditions that shape our experience.
And this blurring is being driven in part by the era of big data and software analytics, right?
Oh, absolutely. The blurring is fundamentally an interrogation of the assumptions that are operating in this era of big data, digital technologies, data sciences, and the software analytics that, they saturate our everyday lives now.
So if reality is increasingly being managed computationally,
Then researchers have to question the practices of computation itself. You can't just take it at face value.
this connects right back to those alternative ontologies of counting we discussed at the beginning.
It does. It involves looking at how statistics can be used subversively. Subversively?
Yes. Questioning the computational practices. Instead of passively accepting the numbers that are produced by algorithms or government data sets, these researchers are using numbers strategically. They're employing statistics as a form of critique against the very systems of power that rely on quantification for control.
So all this intellectual curiosity about methodology is happening at the same time as this strong external force is trying to pull qualitative research back toward a more traditional quantifiable science.
Yes, the neoliberal resistance movement.
Specifically, the scientifically based research, or SBR, framework.
This is the return of the 1980s wars, but this time with even more political and monetary backing. Neoliberal discourses are attempting to, quote, scientize qualitative approaches through these massive evidence-based research efforts.
And this pressure is expanding into graduate training programs.
It is. It's a concerted effort to standardize and control the production of knowledge. The SBR movement became particularly famous in the United States, with legislation like the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. What does that framework actually champion?
It champions epistemologies of rigorous, systematic, and objective methodology, all designed to obtain what it calls reliable and valid knowledge.
And it has preferred methods.
It has highly preferred methods. It prefers highly controlled causal models, particularly experimental designs, and of course the randomized controlled experiment, the RCT.
It's operating on the idea that a social intervention, like a new school curriculum,
Can be treated like a pill dispensed to a patient, and the effect can be measured cleanly and objectively. It's the reemergence of scientism, this assertion of one single version of scientific truth over all others.
and within that SBR framework, how are qualitative methods viewed?
They're viewed as distinctly inferior. There's no other way to put it.
So they're relegated to what, the preliminary stages?
Exactly. They're seen as suitable only for exploratory work, for initial hypothesis generation, or for studying subjective experiences that are not, amenable to real scientific generalization. They are not seen as capable of producing valid evidence.
And it gets worse than that, doesn't it?
It does. The framework's most rigid proponents often accuse qualitative work of being overtly political or even a disguised version of Marxism.
An association that's clearly used to discredit its funding and legitimacy.
Of course.
So what is the core critique of SBR that's coming from the interpretive community? How do they fight back?
Well, the critics call SBR a profound throwback, a return to the rigid, highly controlled designs of the Campbell-Stanley era from the mid-20th century.
So they see it as old-fashioned.
They see it as embracing a narrow, conservative view of science and a dogmatic adherence to the exclusive reliance on quantitative methods. And often, these methods are based on flawed, neoclassical clinical trial models that just don't translate well to complex social settings like a classroom or a community.
The critics argue that SBR has actually tarnished the authority of science.
Yes, by applying that monolithic model of science so inappropriately.
So SBR is the discipline's conservative opposition, trying to enforce conformity. Meanwhile, the interpretive community has responded not just defensively, but by embracing these radical theoretical shifts in the other direction.
Yes.
Specifically, what the sources are calling the new materialisms.
This is the revolutionary side of the coin. New materialism represents a fourth formation within that interpretive tradition, and it marks a decisive break from the previous traditions that focus so heavily on human consciousness, on language, on meaning.
So this new scholarship moves decisively from post-humanist to non-representational theories.
It does.
This sounds extremely abstract. How do we make this concrete for the learner?
Okay, we need to understand the rupture. A scholar named Vanini suggests this scholarship focuses on three core themes that challenge the very foundation of how we define what is even researchable.
Okay, let's start with the first one, the post-humanist ontology.
This is the idea that conceives of matter itself as exhibiting agency.
Matter has agency. A rock has agency.
In this view, yes. And this profoundly challenges the traditional qualitative focus on the human subject. It means we have to completely rethink agency in the research setting. Agency is not just held by the people in the room.
It's shared with the objects, the architecture, the technology.
The environment, even the molecules, everything is an actor.
Okay, if matter has agency, what does that mean for a researcher who's studying, say, a classroom?
You are no longer studying only the teacher and the students and their narratives about the classroom. You must also study the material conditions.
Like what?
The heat of the room, the texture of the desks, the quality of the light coming from the screen, the chemical composition of the curriculum documents themselves.
Because these material things are not just passive backdrops.
They are active agents that are performing and shaping the reality of that classroom experience. The researcher must attend to all the non-human elements.
Wow. Okay, what about the second theme? Biopolitical and bioethical issues.
This deals with life and the human, and the incredibly complex questions around the nature of life and existence in an era of technological, biological, and planetary change.
So it's about how political power increasingly manages and controls life at a biological and population level.
Exactly. The body, the environment, technology, they all become subjects of inquiry.
And finally, the third theme, this re-engagement with political economy.
And this isn't just old-school Marxist analysis. It's a new emphasis on the relationship between the material details of everyday life and the broader geopolitical and socioeconomic structure.
So it's understanding how the texture, the material things, the infrastructure of our existence.
Are inseparable from global power structures, from supply chains, from economic inequality.
This is where the new materialists actively challenge those traditional qualitative concepts. If they're focused on matter and non-representational theories, what traditional terms do they call into question?
Well, they actively challenge and often outright dismiss terms that have long been the absolute bedrock of ethnographic and interpretive work. They demand we rethink terms like agency, but only as a human property. They question voice, subject experience, presence, self, narrative, subjectivity, meaning, mind, consciousness, data, analysis, interpretation, and even the word science itself.
That is a total rejection of constructivism.
Yeah.
Sounds like the new materialists are saying, we don't care about the story you tell me about the desk. We care about the matter that shapes how you sit at the desk.
They are indeed turning the lens onto the material, the non-representational and the effective, the feelings and forces that are immediate and powerful but are not easily articulated through language.
And this is where research becomes almost like art.
It has to. It demands new methods to capture data that goes far beyond transcripts and interviews. This scholarship represents a new paradigm that challenges the very foundation of qualitative knowledge production. It's celebrating this turn to materiality that's happening across the social sciences and humanities.
Let's pivot now from these high-stakes theoretical wars to the actual practice on the ground. How does a researcher navigate all these conflicting currents and these radical demands?
Well, the sources introduce a concept that I think is really useful here. They talk about the qualitative researcher as a bricoleur.
A bricoleur, what is that?
The term is crucial because it gives the researcher a clear identity in this chaotic landscape. A bricoleur is a multi-talented figure. You can think of them as a resourceful jack of all trades,
A tinkerer.
a tinkerer, a handy person. They are adept at performing a large number of diverse tasks, ranging from, formal interviewing to intense self-reflection and introspection.
The sources have some great descriptions. They call the bricoleur a musician, a novelist, a social critic, an activist, a filmmaker, and a quilt maker. But that last one sounds especially descriptive to me.
The quilt maker imagery is perfect, isn't it? The bricoleur's work is this complex, quilt-like assemblage of methods.
So you're pulling from everything.
Everything. Ethnography, ethnotheology, cinema, montage, narrative, a reflexive collage. Their final research product is this emergent construction. It's pieced together from all these diverse methodological scraps to fit the specific needs of a complex situation.
Rather than adhering to a rigid, standardized format like an RCT.
Exactly. And the bricoleur has to be flexible enough to deal with the legacy of the paradigm wars. They have to be able to move freely between all these conflicting ideas we've been talking about.
So that intellectual flexibility is their core identity.
It has to be. They must be able to move between competing and overlapping paradigms. They attach belief systems that link the user to a worldview, and therefore they have to be widely read. They have to be knowledgeable about many interpretive traditions.
Feminism, Marxism, constructivism, queer theory, postmaterialism, and so on.
Yes. If they weren't, they wouldn't know which scraps of methodology to use for their quilt.
And what is the political stance of the critical bricklayer in this process?
The critical bricklers, they stress the dialectical and hermeneutic nature of interdisciplinary inquiry. They emphasize that knowledge is power and that there is no such thing as value-free science.
So their work is fundamentally ethical and political from the start.
Yes, seeking what they call a civil social science based on a politics of hope. They understand that their research findings will have policy implications and will serve specific ends, whether they intend them to or not.
So when we try to define qualitative research today, with all this complexity, what is the best summary that encompasses all of it?
The best definition is that qualitative research is an interdisciplinary, a transdisciplinary, and sometimes even a counterdisciplinary field.
Counterdisciplinary.
Yes, actively working against the grain of established disciplines. It crosscuts the humanities, the social sciences, and even the physical sciences. At its core, it's defined as a set of interpretive material practices that make the world visible.
And those material practices are the tools that are used to create representations.
Precisely. They turn the world into a series of representations. Field notes, interviews, photographs, recordings, memos to yourself. The primary emphasis is on the naturalistic perspective.
Meaning studying human behavior and experience in natural, real-world settings.
Exactly. The goal is a deep understanding of the human experience through careful interpretation and analysis, always being sensitive to the value of that multi-method bricolage approach.
This complexity can feel, frankly, overwhelming for a learner just trying to get a handle on the discipline.
Of course.
So to anchor all this theory, let's use the structure that the sources provide. The entire qualitative research process, they say, can be organized into 5 conceptual phases. This provides a kind of roadmap for the bricklayer.
Yes. This framework is the architectural blueprint of the field. It moves you logically from philosophy to practice.
Okay, let's start with phase 1, the researcher, the multicultural subject. This is the essential first step, recognizing the self.
Correct. Phase 1 demands intense self-reflection. It is all about locating yourself, the researcher, in history and in various research traditions.
So identify your own class, gender, race, cultural position.
Yes. And why? Because the researcher must confront the ethics and politics of research, including how they view the other as a research subject.
Why is this confrontation so vital today?
It's the decolonization project realized in practice. The researcher can no longer claim to be a neutral, objective observer. They can't.
That's no longer a credible position.
It is absolutely no longer acceptable for the human disciplines to research the native, the indigenous other, in this spirit of so-called value-free inquiry. Your identity, your positionality, that is part of the research instrument.
Can you give an example?
Sure. If I'm a wealthy, white, male academic studying poverty in a racialized community, my own relationship to wealth, race, and power fundamentally shapes the questions I ask, the rapport I build, and the interpretations I make. To ignore that isn't just bad practice, it's ethically irresponsible.
Okay, so once that deep reflective work is done, we move to phase 2, theoretical paradigms and perspectives. This is choosing the philosophical lens.
Every qualitative researcher has to be a philosopher, even if they don't know it. They are bound by a set of ontological, epistemological, and methodological premises. This phase is where you consciously establish those premises.
Let's just clarify those 3 concepts one more time because they are absolutely central to phase 2.
Okay. Ontology asks, what is the nature of reality? Is it singular and objective, like in positivism, or is it multiple and constructed, like in constructivism?
Right.
Epistemology asks, what is the relationship between me, the knower, and the thing to be known? Am I separate from what I study, or am I inevitably interwoven with it?
And finally, methodology.
Methodology asks, okay, given my assumptions about reality and my relationship to it, how do I go about knowing the world? What's my strategy?
And the sources list an immense number of possible paradigms for phase 2, reflecting that big tent approach you mentioned.
The variety is staggering. You have positivism, post-positivism, interpretive constructivism, hermeneutics, feminism, ethnic and racialized discourses, critical theory, Marxist models, cultural studies, queer theory, post-colonialism, post-materialism.
And the choice you make here has huge consequences down the line.
It dictates everything that follows. For instance, if you choose interpretive constructivism, you won't be seeking internal and external validity in the positivist sense. Instead, you'll seek alternative criteria like trustworthiness, credibility, transferability.
And if you choose a Marxist model,
Then you are operating with a materialist, realist ontology. You're emphasizing the structural reality of difference in terms of race, class, and gender. Your whole project is different.
okay, so the philosophy is set. We then move to phase 3, strategies of inquiry and interpretive paradigms. This is selecting the core research design.
This is the critical stage that acts as the bridge. It connects the theoretical paradigm you chose in phase 2 to the empirical material you're going to gather in phase 4.
So this is where you choose your overall blueprint.
Exactly. You select a flexible research design that is appropriate for investigating your topic and addresses those critical issues of representation and legitimation that came up in phase 1.
What are the primary strategies that are available in phase 3?
The key strategies include the case study, which is a deep investigation of one instance of something. There's grounded theory, which is about developing theory inductively from the data itself.
So you build the theory up from the ground, so to speak.
Exactly. There's ethnography, which is that long-term observation of a cultural group. There's life history or oral history. And then there's the complex use of triangulation.
But not just to validate findings anymore.
No, to enrich them, to use multiple methods or data sources to get a more complex, multifaceted picture. A researcher using grounded theory, for example, is deliberately choosing a design that seeks to generate new concepts rather than just testing existing hypotheses.
After this strategy, we finally get to the practical toolkit in phase 4, methods of collecting and analyzing empirical materials.
Phase 4 focuses on the actual tools you use in the field. This is the hands-on work.
So this includes standard practices like observation and interviews.
Yes, but also much more specialized methods. Things like narrative inquiry, visual research using photo voice, or film autoethnography, where the researcher's own experience becomes the data.
And things like focus groups and arts-based inquiry.
Yes, and specialized analysis of talk and text. Qualitative research is really defined by the use of these multiple, rich methods to capture the texture and the detail of human experience.
And finally, the last step, phase 5, the art and politics of interpretation, evaluation, and presentation. This seems to bring us right back full circle to the political heart of the discipline.
It absolutely does. This phase deals with the criteria used for evaluation. How do we judge if this work is any good? It deals with policy implications, with politics, and with the crucial act of writing research as a method of inquiry.
Writing is a method of inquiry, not just reporting.
Exactly. The political economy of critical social inquiry is central here because the question is no longer just, what did I find? The question is, how will this finding be used and who benefits from it being used in that way?
The sources describe the interpretive practice in phase 5 as endlessly creative and interpretive.
It is inherently creative. The researcher is not a passive recorder of facts. They are creating narrative compositions based on their field notes, interviews, and observations.
So the final written text has to serve multiple forms.
It often does. It might need to be confessional, realist, impressionistic, critical, literary, analytic, all at once. This final practice of making sense of the findings is explicitly viewed as being both artistic and political.
So applied qualitative research is inherently political.
It has to be. It influences policy, it changes organizational behavior, and it creates spaces for the people who are studied to speak for themselves and to be heard.
The researcher isn't just delivering findings, they are staging an intervention.
Exactly. And that intervention is crafted with incredible intention and artistry.
We've traveled through a history of academic warfare, through a pragmatic resolution, and now into these current theoretical ruptures, moving toward post-materialism. As we conclude this deep dive, we really need to synthesize the core, interwoven tensions that define qualitative research right now.
You're right. Qualitative inquiry today exists in this state of dynamic friction. It embraces two constant, powerful tensions that are pulling it in opposite directions.
And these tensions dictate everything, its priorities, its funding, its public reception.
Everything.
Okay, so let's name tension 1, the broad, revolutionary pull toward liberation and transformation.
This is the tradition that is drawn toward a broad, interpretive, post-experimental, postmodern, feminist, and critical sensibility. This is the intellectual current that seeks liberation and transformation. It embraces uncertainty, cultural critique, and reflexivity.
This is the heart of the social justice mandate.
It is.
And then there's tension 2, the pull toward conservatism, structure, and control.
It is simultaneously drawn to the narrow, defined, positivist, post-positivist, naturalistic conception of human experience. This is the desire for standardized rigor, for measurement, for generalized findings.
And this is often fueled by that pervasive, conservative, neoliberal global culture.
A culture that values metrics, audit systems, and quantifiable results above all else.
So the current environment is defined by these conflicting currents, the push for metrics and standardized evidence on one side versus the push for transformation and radical subjectivity on the other.
The tension is articulated within the discipline itself, and it really is a battle for the soul of social science.
But the result of this struggle, despite all the political pressure, is that the social science tent has actually gotten bigger.
It has had to, simply to survive and remain relevant.
So what definitions of science are welcome inside this larger tent today?
Many diverse definitions. We now accommodate interpretive science, pragmatic science, materialist science, that's the new materialists, indigenous science, and science based on feminist standpoint methodologies.
So this expansion fundamentally challenges the monolithic model of science that dominated for so long.
It's a politics of hope, really, a space where different viewpoints and different definitions of rigor can be accommodated, so long as the researcher is clear and upfront about their philosophical commitments, the ones they outlined back in phase 2.
And this all loops back to our initial goal, understanding the history, to understand the present. So why should our learner care about these paradigm wars and theoretical ruptures from the 1980s or the new materialist debates of today?
You should care, because the ongoing battle between these historical moments, the politics, the paradigms, the practices, it all determines how qualitative inquiry methods function today.
It's not just abstract history.
Not at all. It dictates which graduate programs teach what methods. It dictates which methods get funded by the major granting bodies. It dictates which findings get published in the top journals. And ultimately, it dictates which forms of knowledge are accepted as legitimate truth by policymakers.
So if you understand the paradigms,
You understand the rules of the game that's being played right now.
that immediately connects this dense academic struggle to real-world impact. As we close this deep dive, let's leave our learner with a final, provocative thought to take away from this complex landscape.
Okay. Given everything we have discussed, the researcher as a bricoleur, the interpretive practices, the radical challenge of the new materialisms, what are the implications for you when research is described as being endlessly creative and interpretive?
Where the findings are simultaneously artistic and political.
Yes. If knowledge is not simply found, but is actively constructed and represented by you, the researcher, what new ethical and professional responsibility does that place on you as the person crafting that representation?
And I suppose the ultimate question raised by this deep dive into the politics of evidence is this. Since evidence can be produced, constructed, and represented in so many different ways, what are the implications when the politics of evidence determines what counts as truth, and therefore who gets funded and who gets ignored?
That's a challenge that demands not just methodological clarity, but immense intellectual and moral courage from every single inquirer out there.
An excellent note to end on. Thank you for guiding us through this incredibly dynamic and, I think, vital discipline.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.